Well, welcome everyone to today's panel on character study. We have a wonderful group of authors to bomb with questions, and I'm going to start us off after a brief introduction. And this is on character study, something that we all have to pay attention to in our books. So to introduce our panel, there is VK Powell, and VK is a 30-year veteran of a mid-sized police department. VK's career spanned numerous positions, including beat officer, homicide detective, vice narcotics lieutenant, district captain, and assistant chief of police. And the whole time, no one knew that beneath the badge, Kevlar vest, and uniform rested the heart of a hopeless romantic. Now retired, VK devotes her time to writing and traveling. Next, we have Lynn Hemphill. Lynn is Kenya-born and bred, but now lives in Oxfordshire with her partner and 2 children. She writes every spare moment she can find between teaching science, online, and developing screenplays with her writing partner, Eloise Castell. Hopefully I did.
Eloise Castell, yeah.
Eloise Castell, okay. Next, we have Genevieve McCluer. Genevieve was born in California and grew up in numerous cities across the country. She studied criminal justice, changing her focus to writing. Obsessed with mythology, she bases her stories on that genre. She lives in Arizona with her partner and cats, where she works on far too many novels. And I can attest that I think we all do that to some degree. And last but certainly not least, Carsen Taite, who's an award-winning author of 30 novels in print. Her latest novel, Perilous Obsession, features an intrepid reporter and a whistleblower cop who become reluctant allies in the hunt for a serial killer. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining the panel. So we're going to start off with a few questions that I have, and then we'll get to the Q&A box for the audience. So, do you create characters around a story idea, or does the story become created around your characters? And we're going to start off with Carsen.
Yes.
Okay, brief. That's considered a brief.
No, I mean both. It depends. This particular book, Perilous Obsession, that just came out in February, started with a character. I watched the HBO series, which I'm going to get the name wrong now because I think it's called I'll Come For You in the Dark. It's about Patton Oswalt's wife, Michelle, who was a crime blogger and a writer for various newspapers. And she got obsessed with finding the serial killer, and she kind of became part of this group of online detectives. And she was an investigative reporter, so she enlisted all these people to help, but it kind of consumed her life. And I was intrigued by her character and how a person could just kind of deep dive, not an actual cop or a private detective, but just a regular citizen could just become immersed in this hunt for justice, basically, for these victims that she met their families. And she was just so deeply involved in the story and how that altered her whole life. And so that kind of inspired the story. So that particular story started with a character. And then I kind of riffed off that. And, it's different from real life because I had to think about what kind of character could be kind of the antithesis of that. And I thought, a cop who isn't going to want a private individual messing with their stuff. And I thought that would be a good foil. So that book started with 2 characters and how the story could develop from there. But it isn't always the case. Sometimes it starts with a story idea, and then I have to figure out what kind of characters would populate that plot. So that's my not brief answer.
Is there one that you find easier than the other?
No, I think what's easiest is when you work with what feels natural, like you don't try and force, like, I want to write a book about a dog catcher. I mean, I'm just making that up, obviously, and then you're trying to figure out what kind of story could I write about that person. I think you just kind of have to, what feels like a natural, organic source of both a character and plot to make your story develop. I think that's when you feel that groove, it's right. And then the story unfolds from there.
Thank you. Genevieve, what about you?
Well, Carsen stole my answer.
Oh, she does that a lot. Don't be offended.
Yeah, it really just depends on the story. Some of them work a lot better with a character focus, and I'll come up, I will have exactly the character that I want to use, but not entirely the story, or I'll have a story pretty well thought out, but I'm still working in the character. Though usually I don't actually start until I have at least some semblance of both of those ideas. I don't know what you're trying to do.
Oh, another one. Well, thank you. Lynn?
I'm going to be very boring and say exactly the same thing. Sometimes I'll have, I think I usually start with the characters and the story comes afterwards. But what tends to happen is that as the story gets going, the characters change massively. So the book that came out in February, The Willing, with that one I had the main character, just the idea of an exhausted person who sort of was able to bring people back from the dead, and sort of falling in love with one of the people that she brought back. But as I wrote the story, she became more positive and more cheerful, and more sort of like look on the bright side. And somebody else took over the very deeply exhausted and depressed aspect of it. So I think I usually start with the people, but the story then changes them massively as well.
So it kind of morphs organically as you write.
Yeah, I think so.
Perfect. Thank you. And VK?
Well, I'm going to be boring too, ditto what everyone else has already said. I think, first of all, I get this kernel of an idea, and then I think, okay, what if these two people did this thing or had this thing happen or whatever? And then I do a deep dive into characters because I am a plotter, therefore I must plot. So I get all these characters figured out in my head, and then start trying to figure out what the story around this kernel is going to be that will develop the characters as they move along in the story and show their development as well. So it's kind of how it goes for me.
And just out of curiosity, who's a planner and who is not, as far as story development? Planners?
Both. We were on a long panel about this yesterday.
And then we have those who kind of just write by the seat of our pants.
Yeah. I'm getting better at planning.
Don't do it. Don't go to the dark side.
Right, exactly. I have to share those sentiments.
There's
Exactly.
light at the end of the tunnel. Come this way.
No light.
Whatever I say,
The train
whatever
coming
works
towards
for
me, isn't
you,
it?
I just don't understand how you can kind of like know the beginning and the everything in between and the end.
Yeah. There's always either one, like a couple of very particular scenes that have to be in there, and by the time you get to them, you're like, yeah, that's a bit rubbish now, isn't it?
All right, let's not get in trouble by going off topic, I guess, here. Let's go to the next one, and I'll have Genevieve go first. Do you know right away who will be the protagonist, or does that form as you write?
I think I have always known who the protagonist was in the story. I can't think of any time that hasn't been the case. Because like I said, I try to always have some idea of who the story is going to be about before I actually, I was going to say put pen to paper, but I always just use a keyboard, so ruins the metaphor. But it just I can't really start a story without having at least a decent idea of what I want to be telling. So I need to know who I'm telling that story about.
Okay. And how about Lynn?
I do generally stick with the same main character, but the sort of the love interests, and I think everybody beside them and around them, those characters change a lot and take me by surprise. They sometimes sort of come and sort of tell me, oh, actually, by the way, I kissed your main character last night. I don't think you noticed. I'm like, you weren't even supposed to be the love interest. So it's I think I would generally stick with them. The main character, I think, is usually pretty set in my head, except for with The Willing, where I told the story from both points of view because I couldn't decide who the main character was. Out of the two girls, I was just sort of they both had so much to say about it, so I had to alternate their chapters.
Okay, VK.
I think I, most of the time, know who my protagonist is going to be because I usually start with some form of law enforcement. And that's where it all begins. And I put them in these situations. But invariably, the secondary character, second main character, will butt in with her wooing ways, trying to lure my poor police officer into some kind of compromising position. And then by the end of the story, I like them both. So, you know, there's that.
But we should like them both, right?
Yeah.
That's right. That's the hope anyway.
Even if they're really, really terrible people, I was like, no, you're an awful person. I love you so much.
Absolutely. And Carsen?
So I guess with the exception of a 3-book series and some short stories, all of my novels have 2 protagonists. And although I usually start out with them kind of feeling on equal footing, I tend to, at some point, either the beginning, middle, or end, I lean toward one of them. It's their story. So they might have equal page time, they might have equal development, but in the end, one of them, it's their story to tell. You know, it just kind of evolves that way, and it's not always who I expect. And I mean, I'm not one of those people who are like, the characters took the story away, you know. I mean, but I have total control. I'm writing the story, I'm creating out of my head, but at some point, the story kind of morphs for me, and that's kind of why I don't like to plan. I kind of like to see where things take me, because they just kind of, the journey goes off in a different direction. And I like to, that process is what makes writing fun for me. Like if I planned in advance, I would not even write the book, because I'd be like, okay, well, here's a nice little outline.
Told.
Yeah, the story's told. I don't need to, there's no adventure along the way. But yeah, it becomes their story. And in this book, it's interesting because to me, the story became more about not the reporter character, you know, so it became just as much the story of the other character. And I did not expect that to be the case. So that was kind of a fun journey.
I like all those little surprises that you end up with along the way, because let's face it, we have to read our own work like a million times before it gets out the door, right? And if we can't stand the characters and we're bored, what does that say, right?
That's a really good point.
Then you really panic. So I love those little surprises, and I'm glad you experienced them. Okay, just a reminder to our audience, if you have a question for our panelists, please put it in the Q&A, and I'll be happy to pass it along. So this next one, we're going to start with Lynn. Do you have a favorite character in each of the books you've written?
I think I do, but you know, they're fictional, so I'm allowed to say that. And a lot of this, The Willing is possibly the one I'm not sure who my favorite character is, but I think on balance, it's probably Talia, because she's extremely screwed up. She is, you know, just trying so hard to function on a daily basis, and I'm very fond of her for managing it. And Kitty has got a lot of support from, you know, there's people who love her and show her, whereas Talia feels very alone, and I think she's doing great. I'm very proud. But in general, I do tend to have a favorite. And sometimes the character I like the most is different from the person I would like the most if I knew them in real life. So you know which ones you're going to get along well with as a person, but the ones that are really interesting and fascinating to look at, those ones maybe I would find it more difficult to get along with. The Rose in Not Broken, I think she's such a spiky person. I would find her quite difficult to get along with, but she is fun to write.
Okay. And BK.
Well, I think I initially, as I said previously, I initially start off thinking I'm really going to love this cop character just because, you know, I identify with that from my former life. And then as the story goes on, I start, you know, falling for the other character. And I think, well, you know, she's really nice. I kind of like her. So I think by the end of the story, I can't really say who my favorite really is, because I like them both equally, and they both show a different side of themselves throughout the story than the one that I initially started with. So I like that.
Yeah, those are great revelations along the way.
Yeah.
Carsen?
I don't know that I have a favorite in each book I've written. I have some favorites that arc over time. And there are some there's some books that I have a favorite. If anyone's read my work, they'll know I have a favorite private detective who appears, I've lost count of how many times and how many books, just because it's not just convenient, but I like this character. I've liked this character since book 2. And so it's just been kind of fun to weave her into other stories. So I just, you know, I definitely have some favorites, and if you read my work, you'll know who they are.
And that's a good selling point. I like that. Genevieve, favorite?
Yeah, I pretty much always have a favorite character in my stories. Though honestly, the main character from Cold Blood, my most recent story, it might just be my favorite character in any of my books. Kalila Yassin. She is an angry, bloodthirsty asshole who gets a bunch of character development, and I love her at both ends of her arc.
That's great. That sounds like a very interesting character. We do have one question in the Q&A. Let's go with that. Mary wants to know, do any of your characters you develop resemble a real life person you know or have seen in the different mediums of media? So whether it be TV or books or other forms. Let's start with Genevieve.
Well, I was hoping to have more time to come up with one, because the best answer I've got is Mia in Olivia is actually based on me, which is always hilarious because she has both been a fan favorite of like half the people who've read it and been accused of being unrealistic.
Well, I happen to like that character a lot, so just saying. Carsen?
You were going to come to me next, and I'm like, so I have this bad habit of forgetting characters' names. In my defense, this was like book number 4. Nothing but the truth. I'm gonna say the main character's name is Brett, and that was based on something that actually happened to me. And I'm not sure that character does have some traits of mine. but it was based on a true story that happened to me, and so some of me sprinkled into that characters.
Okay. VK?
I have a tendency to use a lot of characters from my former career, especially if it's somebody that needs to be punished or somebody that needs to pay for a crime or somebody that may need to die. So,
Nothing wrong with that.
to use people from my former career. So there are a lot of them in my books sprinkled throughout the years, and I can't remember any of their names either, but they're all there.
There's only something wrong with it if you start mailing them excerpts as a threat.
Good point, Genevieve. I haven't done that yet, but it's a good thought. This is you.
Oh, and Lynn?
So usually, no. Usually, if there's any one character in my books who who represents someone in real life, I will ask their permission and name them after that person. And I've done so with, there'll be very small characters, and it'll be just sort of like an affectionate gesture. But with Not Broken, Max is 100% my husband. And he knows that. Like, he picked the book up. He picked the book up and he was like, "That's me, right?" I'm like, "Well, yeah, maybe." So all like the things that he says and the stupid like games he makes up to distract me when I'm panicking and so on, that's it. So like on the plus side, Max is a really, really, really lovely character. So obviously it's kind of like I didn't think it was quite so obvious, but he's quite smug about it. It's okay.
I don't know if I'd ever be able to name someone that I know in a book, but that's okay. Go ahead, Carsen.
So I love that book, Lynn, by the way. But I did have a reader, Chris Perez, who won a contest to be named a character in my book. And with her permission, I actually made her a character in my book because I know her pretty well. She loves to serve on juries. Like that's her thing. If she gets jury duty, it is like she's so excited. And I wanted to write, I was writing a novella about my bounty hunter character who winds up being on a jury, which she hates. And I thought, how fun would it be to have Chris be this character who loves to be on juries, be on a character who hates to be on juries. But they wind up, being the protagonists of the story. Mm-hmm. And so with Chris' permission, I got to write my friend Chris into the story. And I hope it was an affectionate way, but she let me just totally steal her life. So
I did actually in the Willing. I just remembered in the Willing, I used my best friend and her housemate, Oxford Uni alumni, and have told me many times about the complete insanity of the university. And I was right. Talia is a student at Oxford and is having a bit of a breakdown. And I put my friend's housemate as an insert in there to comfort her as a complete stranger. So with her permission, using her physical description and her words of, you either leave this place as a nervous wreck or a member of the government, and there's no in between.
Well, they say, write what you know. So we have to know the people that we're writing, right? In some way. Let's see, we have another question from Joni. Have you ever created a character that you love so much that you can't let her go at the end of the novel? That's a good question. Let's start with BK.
Okay, let's see. I would probably have to say Bennett Carlisle in the first book in my Fairview Station series called Captain's Choice. Bennett Carlisle is one of the lead characters, and she is the eldest daughter in the Carlisle clan. And I often pick her up, or I have picked her up in subsequent books since Captain's Choice. I really like plugging her in and having her make a cameo in other books. And she actually appears in my February release called Deadly Secrets. She's also, does a few cameo appearances in that as well. So I really like that character. She has what I think are a lot of characteristics that I had that time in my life. So I like her. I like Bennett Carlisle.
Okay, thank you. Carsen?
Well, I have a couple, and I alluded to one before. Her name is Skye Keaton. She was in my second book, It Should Be a Crime, she was a secondary character. She was a main character in my fifth book, The Best Defense. And I can reel that off the top of my head because I just wrote, in my book that's coming out in June, there's a bonus short story, and it has to do with Skye. And I just wrote an intro to that. And I've lost count of how many times I've inserted Skye in a story, but it's been a lot. And she's actually in the book that comes out in June, in addition to being in the short story that follows it. And in that second book, she was like a foil to one of the main characters, and someone I never would have considered writing a whole story about, but she was bad and not seemingly redeemable. And I used her to showcase the other characters' honorableness. But I became intrigued with her and her story. And so I wrote a whole book about her, and then I've used her since, many, many times. And for some reason, that particular character and her journey has really stuck with me over the years, many years.
That's okay. When you find something you like, we should stick with it, right?
Yes.
Lynn, how about you?
So I almost never sort of think of writing a series because I tend to be like, okay, that's fun, boing, and then skip on to something completely weird. And I went from The Willing, which is about magic and dead people, and the next book was about mermaids, and that's coming out in November. But there is one character actually from Not Broken, or two characters, Miho and Chelsea, who are very small side characters, and who are basically sort of, Miho is the sweet little innocent, like completely in love with the lead singer of the band, and Chelsea is sort of, Chelsea is her best friend. And as I was writing it, I was thinking, Chelsea, you kind of love Miho, don't you? So I kind of want to one day write a book about them. Chelsea finally, Miho finally turning around to Chelsea and going, oh, wow, okay, yeah, you're actually, I really like you. And Chelsea's going sort of, hey, you finally figured it out. Excellent. I'm so glad. Let's move on.
See, you already have a basis. That's a wonderful thing, right? And Genevieve, how about you?
Almost every character I write, I fall in love so easily. I need to get out like a conspiracy board for all of the crossover and everything. I have the entire, like, almost every character in my first book shows up in at least another book. Olivia and Mia both show up in Cold Blood. Devana from A Fey Tale is first introduced in Olivia. I already have drafts for more stories that feature Cleela and Dorenia from Cold Blood. I just love my characters a lot.
And you should. That's a good thing. Okay. Let's go on. I'll remind the audience that there's a sale going on all weekend in the web store on select ebook backlists of titles from all of our participants. So please check that out. Let's see. Do you enjoy reading about characters with flaws that are central to the story, or do you prefer that they just be an incidental detail? And let's start with Carsen.
I think, I mean, as much as I talk about being a pantser instead of a plotter, I think that it's important that if you put something in your story, it have a reason to be there. And so, you can have flaws, minor things like that are incidental to the story. But I think if it's a big thing, it needs to have a reason for being there. You need to be using it to showcase some reason for your character doing something, some need for them to fill, some part of their journey that makes sense to the reader. And so that's how I feel as a writer and as a reader, that's kind of what I want to see. Because otherwise I'm like, why did they bring this up? Why is this in here? I'm looking for when's this going to get resolved, or where is this leading? And so I don't like those details that are extraneous that don't matter to the story. If they're significant, I think they need to have a reason for being there.
I agree. Lynn?
I definitely am a big fan of the sort of check off done idea that you don't put something in unless you're planning to use it by the end of the story. And but also even before, so it took me a long time to actually learn how story structure works. I didn't, I started writing books and so on without really understanding the concept of narrative, because why would you go and research something you're just about to dive headfirst into? So even before learning how plotting and story beats worked, I always needed my characters to overcome a personal battle, or sort of, so there's the the plot thing that they have to overcome, but the most important thing for me has always been going, where are they at the beginning and what have they changed, what have they overcome by the end? Because otherwise it's kind of like, why would anyone care about it? And I know there's loads and loads of amazing stories with static character arcs, and I love those, especially in movies. Steve Rogers as a classic static character arc in some movies, but I don't like writing them, and I tend to prefer reading character development rather than just.
Thank you. And Genevieve?
I definitely think that a character's flaws should generally influence the story. Typically, mine come from trauma, so that tends to affect the development of the story a lot. Since everybody else already gave that answer, I'd like to more focus on how a lot of other flaws can really help build a character and make them feel more real without it having to actually influence the story in any particular way. Like a character simply behaving, flawed, angry, hurt in ways that aren't necessarily important for the story still can build up a lot that will help the story as a whole benefit from it.
And not be perfect by the end as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and shows a lot of who that character really is at their base.
And it can make them relatable. Like we can relate. It's hard to relate to someone who's perfect,
Yeah. Right.
No, I have an easy time with that.
I cannot relate to you.
No. And BK, you want to join in the banter?
Well, I'm not sure that I can really add anything that hadn't already been discussed here. I believe that most of the time I include flawed characters because I want readers to be able to connect with the fact that this person is not perfect, that they do have issues, and that maybe they can see a portion of themselves in this character and then watch as they develop through whatever's going on in their lives. So, pretty much what everybody else says, it's the development of the character and showing that growth throughout the story that I think is important.
And who doesn't love a villain redemption arc as well?
Yes, exactly.
Exactly. In fact, there are some books that I've recently read that I really did not like the character at the beginning, one of the characters, and by midway through, I was like rooting for them, like, yes, come on, get your shit together, right? Make me love you.
Yeah.
I think that those are fun characters. And again, relatable. Let's see here. How do you decide on your character's physical traits? Do you have a picture in your head when you start, or is that something that happens organically as you write? And does your cover have to be kind of representative of that? And let's start with Lynn.
Actually, I don't usually have a very particular image in mind, and it'll often change. And in fact, some of the physical characteristics have changed most recently because somebody that I knew has said, "Oh, you know what? I've never seen representation of myself in a book." And I'm like, you know what? I can change that. And I will try and sew Talia as Jewish, because at the time of writing, I was talking, when I first decided it, I was talking to a friend who was just like, there is not enough just unimportant random Jewish representation. It doesn't just have to be about being Jewish. It has, you know, she's just incidentally a very devout Jew. And because he was talking about that, he's a rabbi, he was talking about that, and I was sort of like, you know what, you're right, okay, well, if you don't mind, like, I'm not Jewish, but I'll make Talia Jewish because it's incidental. And it's, I don't have to, you know, that's obviously not a physical trait, but I have done that with physical traits for Rose and for like Miho and for a couple of other characters in books before BSB. Just sort of like somebody says, oh, do you know what, I don't see enough books with redhead characters in, and I'll be like, well, okay, there's another thing to add into a book. So I don't think that the physical appearance matters to me so much, because I've changed their gender so many times, and their like country of origin so many times, and their name so many times. So physical appearance, I'm like, take your pick, guys. Who do we have?
Okay, well, thank you. Genevieve.
I usually only have a couple traits in mind, if that. I'm not that visual, and I'm kind of face blind, so I just generally, basically until one of my betas will start pestering me with sending a bunch of pictures, being like, okay, so what do your characters look like? I have no idea until then.
It can be very interesting process to figure out what your character looks like. Carsen?
Or you can just not figure out what your character looks like.
Well, there's that.
Let's be honest, the reader will have it different anyway.
When I read a book, I don't really pay attention to that kind of a thing unless it is integral to the story. I'm writing a book now where the main character in the book is she was a champion college basketball player. So, and that factors into the story in terms of, it's very hard for her to hide. She's really tall and has a large frame, and it, you know, she was a bodyguard, and so but now she's not, and in the bodyguard, as a bodyguard, it was important that she have that, but now she's not. And what she's doing now, she needs to be able to blend a little more, and it makes it difficult for her. So that was a time that a physical trait mattered. But most of the time, I don't really pay attention to those things. That's not, I kind of wish I did a little bit more, but I'm not great with that. And when I read a book, I kind of see people how I want to see them. So I don't really even pay attention to how the writer describes them unless it's an important part of the story. So
makes sense. VK?
I'm kind of along that same line as Carsen. I tend to throw in a few basics initially, and then I let the reader assign those attributes as they read the story. They can decide what they look like, and, you know, those kind of things that gel with them. as a character goes along. As far as book covers, I generally ask that there are no clear faces of characters on the covers of my books. Sometimes that doesn't always work, but for the most part, I ask that there not be any specific faces on the covers of my book, because I don't want people to be able to assign those characteristics to my characters and say, oh, this is what she was trying to describe, because that's not always the case.
Very good. Thank you.
I have had to
Really.
change Talia's hair color and hair length because of the front of this book. She originally had short red hair. So and then we got the cover and like, it doesn't really matter. She can have straight brown hair. It's fine.
Well, we have a few questions in the Q&A from Jane. Do you think about what your characters sound like? Do you have a voice, accent, intonation in mind? All right, let's go with VK.
That's kind of like physical characteristics to me, unless it serves a specific purpose in the story. I don't tend to describe voice specifically, no.
Okay, Genevieve.
Yeah, I often at least have an idea for accent, but for the most part, it's really hard to adequately convey voice in a written medium without going full Lovecraft.
Carsen.
Yeah, I mean, same. There are times when I'll have a character who talks really fast and, then it's hard to get a word in edgewise, and I will convey that kind of a thing because that's important to their character. But otherwise, I may think about it, but I don't necessarily convey that.
And Lynn.
Actually, for the Willing, yes, I did have very particular voices for them because it was written in first person. So first person alternating between the two of them. And so they had to use, particularly as Talia's Scottish and Glaswegian, and Scots language is very important to a lot of Scottish people. I tried to keep her voice and her rhythm of speech in my mind to make that really distinct from Kitty as well, who's a Londoner and a little bit Cockney and stuff. And so although to start with, I actually even wrote in their accents and sort of spelling the way somebody from Scotland would probably spell old and head and that kind of thing. But I took those out afterwards because it's not how you're supposed to write books, is it? To write in somebody's accent is a bit, takes you out of the story a bit. So I didn't write that very much, except for like 8 every now and again, or Talia every now and then say, yeah, but, and that kind of thing. So little bits slip in there, but so I had very specific voices for them, but not so much for anybody else.
Fair enough. And we have a question from Mary from Dutch. How do you research your characters out of your area of expertise? Do you just Google, or do you reach out to someone who's an expert? VK?
I tend to do a little bit of both. Like in my book About Face, there was a forensic anthropologist in that story. And I reached out to the woman who wrote the foremost book on forensic anthropology and sent her an email and said, would you mind talking with me about your subject matter? And could I ask you a few questions? And she was very helpful, so I tend to do that. And in my next book, Catch and Release, there's a wildlife law enforcement officer, AKA a game warden. And I have been in touch with a game warden in my area and have done a ride along. So, I get into it, see what the character's like and how they feel in their environment and that sort of thing. It's part of the actual enjoyment of the writing craft to me.
Excellent. Lynn?
Definitely both. So I'll usually start off by Googling it, but if it's something that I think I need to sort of kind of have a bit more immersion in, I then usually try and find someone who I can talk to and sort of ask questions, to the point where I have talked to someone, a neuroscientist. This was a very long time ago, back when The Willing had a very different ending. I was talking to somebody about epilepsy and neuroimaging, and I happened to be standing next to a paramedic in McDonald's, and I was like, "Excuse me, do you mind if I ask you a really random question?" What would be the first thing you test for if you would suspected an epileptic fit? And then she was like, "Okay." Bless her heart, she explained to me for about 5 minutes, and I was like, "I won't keep you long, I promise." But with Drifting, which is coming out later this year, there's a scene set under, obviously there's a lot of scenes set underwater, as it's based with one character in Mermaid, and I'm hoping to talk to some people who work for the Yorkshire Marine Conservation Society and so on, and talk to them about various things that I can put in.
Great. Carsen?
Yeah, I mean, all of what everyone said. I mean, there are a lot of great books, biographies, autobiographies, great blogs written by people who are in certain professions. But if you can meet them, and here's the caveat, if you meet a lawyer, there are like 40, you might give one take on something, and then there's 40 other takes from 40 different other lawyers. So doing the whole thing, looking all over the place for information is really gives you good representation, or better representation of what you're looking for. But if you can actually talk to a person and have that back and forth, it's really valuable to be able to get some questions answered.
Great. And Genevieve?
I just forgot what the question was.
About how you do research for your book.
Right,
Do you
yes,
interview
yes.
people or Google?
Yep, a lot of it, I'll read scholarly articles, I'll Google, I'll watch YouTube videos, watch documentaries, but most of my books have to do pretty heavily with mental health, and I have a therapist that I know who I consult for a lot of that, especially for my first book, where one of the main characters was a therapist, and like a lot of that came from his knowledge and experience.
Wonderful. Well, we are just about out of time. I'm sorry if there's anyone whose question we didn't get to. Please feel free to email the authors. I'm sure they'd love to answer questions for you. And thank you to all of my panelists. You were fun and insightful, and I'm so glad we all got together. And thank you so much to the audience for your participation, comments, and for supporting all of the authors who work so hard to get the craft to you. Thanks so much.